The cursed video. Watch at your own risk. It began like any other viral sensation. A sudden spike in views, a flurry of shares, an immediate flood of reactions. The video, titled simply, "Watch This," had no description, no explanation, just a blurry thumbnail and a simple, unsettling title. But the curiosity it stirred was palpable, and within hours, it had millions of views. Social media exploded with discussions. Everyone was talking about it, though no one could quite explain why. The first person to notice the strange power of the video was Jacob. A 26-year-old freelance graphic designer, Jacob had a penchant for staying up late, scrolling mindlessly through the endless sea of content that flooded the internet. He was no stranger to odd, bizarre videos, clickbait, pranks, hoaxes, but something about this one stood out. It appeared in his recommended feed, nestled between mundane cat videos and food challenges. The thumbnail was blurry, its hues twisted in an unnatural way, almost as though something was wrong with it. He clicked it, as most people did when curiosity gnawed at them, only to feel the sudden chill of unease settle in his stomach. The video began abruptly with no introduction, no fade-in, just an eerie, unnatural black screen followed by static. Then, the image sharpened. A shadowy figure stood in front of a long hallway, the walls flickering with a dim, almost otherworldly light. The figure was humanoid, but not quite human. It had a shape, a presence, but its face was obscured by something dark, something that shifted in and out of the shadows. It stood motionless, and the video lingered for what felt like an eternity, the tension building without a single word spoken. Jacob couldn't look away. There was something deeply unsettling about it, but he couldn't explain why. It was as if the figure was staring directly at him, even though he knew it was just a recording. Then, after what felt like an unbearable silence, the figure moved, too suddenly, too sharply, too quickly. It turned, and the hallway behind it flickered violently, as if the video were glitching. Static filled the screen, and for a brief moment, Jacob could have sworn he saw something. Alive behind the figure, a pair of glowing eyes peering out from the darkness. The screen flashed white, and then the video cut to black. Jacob blinked, his pulse quickening. He sat frozen, staring at the screen. Something was wrong. The video had been short, no longer than 30 seconds, but it had left him feeling unsettled, like an invisible weight was pressing against his chest. He shook his head and laughed nervously. It was just a weird, poorly made video. People did things like that all the time to get attention. He clicked away, but the unease stayed with him. The lingering thought, what did I just watch? The next day, Jacob felt off, out of sorts, as though something was wrong. He couldn't shake the odd feeling of unease, as if he had missed something important, something that had followed him home after watching the video. He dismissed it at first, blaming it on a lack of sleep. But then, as the day wore on, strange things began to happen. It started subtly. He would hear sounds from other rooms, faint whispers that seemed to echo in the distance. But when he went to check, nothing was there. His computer screen flickered at odd moments, static dancing across the monitor even when he wasn't using it. He tried to ignore it, thinking it was just a glitch, but the whispers grew louder and the flickering on the screen more frequent. Then, that night, things escalated. Jacob sat in his living room, scrolling through his phone, trying to distract himself. His phone buzzed with notifications, an endless stream of comments and shares about the video. Have you seen it yet? This is giving me nightmares. Why does it feel like something is watching me? He ignored them, but his mind kept returning to that hallway in the video, the figure standing there unmoving, its face hidden. He couldn't shake the image, and the unease returned, creeping into every corner of his thoughts. He stood up, trying to clear his head, but just as he passed the hallway in his apartment, he froze. There, at the end of the hallway, was a shadow. The silhouette of something, or someone, standing still, motionless. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. His eyes widened, his heart pounding in his chest. He stepped back, his pulse racing. He must have been imagining things, he thought. It was just the light playing tricks on him. But the shadow didn't move. It just stood there. With shaking hands, he grabbed his phone from his pocket, turning on the flashlight. The hallway was empty. What the hell is going on? He retreated to his bedroom, locking the door behind him, and tried to focus on something else. Anything else. But his phone buzzed again. More notifications. "Is this happening to you too?" One comment read. "I saw something move behind me after I watched the video. It was like a person, but not." Another one said, "It followed me. I keep seeing it in my peripheral vision, in the corners of my house." The next message made Jacob's blood run cold. "Help me. It's standing in my hallway. It's getting closer. Please, God, someone else is watching it." That's when the text stopped. Jacob threw his phone onto the bed, feeling an icy chill spread across his limbs. Something was wrong. The video, whatever it was more than just a hoax. It was real, and it was spreading. But how? Why? The answer came later that night. Jacob woke to the sound of whispers. At first it was distant, just on the edge of hearing, but then it grew louder. He sat up in bed, staring into the dark. His room was silent, save for the soft rustling of the wind outside. But the whispers, so close now, were unmistakable. Low, guttural, indecipherable voices. He stood up, his body trembling. The light switch was out of reach, so he grabbed his phone, turning on the flashlight. As the beam of light cut through the darkness, his eyes fell on the hallway outside his bedroom. The figure stood there. It was no longer just a shadow, no longer confined to the digital realm of the video. The creature, or whatever it was standing in his apartment, just as it had stood in the video. Its face was still obscured by darkness, but its shape was unmistakable. And now it was moving, slowly, inexorably closer to him. His heart pounded, each beat thundering in his chest. He backed away, his hands shaking as he reached for the door. But as he turned the handle, he felt the cold presence behind him, a weight pressing against his back. The whispers grew louder, filling his ears. The figure was close now, and Jacob could feel the cold air around him, could feel its presence drawing nearer. He turned and stumbled into the hallway, but when he turned back, it was gone. The apartment was empty, silent. His phone buzzed again. Another message. He dared not open it. The next morning, Jacob was gone. His apartment was found empty, the door slightly ajar, his phone abandoned on the floor. His friends, frantic, searched the apartment, but there was no sign of him. No trace, just the lingering, oppressive silence that clung to the room. And as the days passed, more people began to disappear. The video spread further, its reach growing, and with it, more reports of strange figures in the dark, whispers in the night, shadows that seemed to move just beyond sight. Some tried to delete the video, but it was too late. The curse was already in motion. No one knew who or what had created the video, or why. All they knew was that once you watched it, once you saw the figure, there was no escape. It would follow you, move closer with each passing moment until there was nothing left but the whispers, growing louder in your mind. And then, just as quickly as it began, the video vanished from the internet. But those who had watched it, they would never forget. The Hidden Chamber of Shadows. The city of London, with its labyrinthine streets and ancient buildings, has always been a place of mystery and intrigue. It is a city where the past lingers in the very stones of its structures, whispering secrets to those who dare to listen. It was in one such building, a decrepit yet grand edifice on the outskirts of the city, that I, Jonathan Harker, found myself residing. The apartment was spacious, with high ceilings and large windows that let in the pale, watery light of the English sun. It was a place that seemed to breathe with a life of its own, its walls imbued with the memories of those who had lived and died within its confines. I had taken the apartment on a whim, drawn by its low rent and the promise of solitude. The landlord, a gaunt man with hollow eyes and a voice like the rustling of dead leaves, had assured me that the place was in good condition, though he had warned me of its age and the peculiarities that came with it. I had dismissed his warnings as the ramblings of an old man, but I would soon come to regret my arrogance. The first few weeks passed without incident. I settled into my new home, unpacking my belongings and arranging the furniture to my liking. The apartment was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards or the distant tolling of the church bells. But as the days turned into weeks, I began to notice strange occurrences, subtle at first, but growing more pronounced with each passing day. It started with the cold spots. There were areas in the apartment where the temperature would drop suddenly, sending a chill down my spine. At first, I attributed it to the drafty windows or the old heating system. But no matter how much I tried to seal the gaps or adjust the thermostat, the cold spots remained. Then there were the sounds, faint whispers that seemed to come from the walls, and the soft rhythmic tapping that would start in the dead of night and continue until dawn. I tried to ignore these disturbances, telling myself that they were merely the product of an overactive imagination. But one night, as I lay in bed, unable to sleep, I heard a sound that I could not dismiss. A low, guttural moan that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the apartment. It was a sound that filled me with a sense of dread, a primal fear that I could not explain. I rose from my bed, my heart pounding in my chest, and followed the sound to its source. It led me to a corner of the living room, where an old, ornate wardrobe stood against the wall. The moaning grew louder as I approached, and I could feel the cold emanating from the wardrobe like a physical force. With trembling hands, I opened the doors, expecting to find some hidden mechanism or perhaps a trapped animal. But what I found was far more unsettling. Behind the wardrobe, hidden by a false wall, was a small, dark chamber. The air inside was thick with the scent of decay, and the walls were lined with strange symbols and markings that seemed to pulse with a faint, malevolent light. In the center of the room stood a wooden table, upon which lay a collection of disturbing artifacts, a rusted knife, a bundle of dried herbs, and a small leather-bound diary. I hesitated for a moment, my mind racing with fear and curiosity. But something compelled me to enter the chamber, to examine the artifacts and uncover the secrets they held. I stepped inside, the cold air wrapping around me like a shroud, and approached the table. The diary caught my eye, its cover worn and cracked with age. I picked it up, my hands trembling, and opened it to the first page. What I saw sent a chill down my spine. The handwriting was familiar, too familiar. It was my own. The entries in the diary were written in a frantic, almost illegible scrawl, as though the author had been in a state of extreme distress. They spoke of strange rituals, of summoning forces beyond human comprehension, and of a presence that lurked in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. As I read further, I realized that the diary was not just a record of past events, it was a warning. The author, myself, or someone who shared my handwriting, had discovered the hidden chamber and had been drawn into a web of darkness and despair. The rituals described in the diary were attempts to ward off the entity that haunted the apartment, but they had only served to strengthen its hold. The final entry was the most chilling of all, a desperate plea for help that ended abruptly, as though the author had been interrupted. I closed the diary, my mind reeling with fear and confusion. How could this be? How could I have written these words when I had no memory of doing so? And what was the entity that haunted this place, that seemed to have a hold on me even now? I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to leave the chamber, to flee the apartment and never return. But as I turned to leave, I heard a sound that froze me in my tracks. A low, guttural laugh that seemed to come from all around me. The air grew colder, and the symbols on the walls began to glow with an eerie, pulsating light. I stumbled out of the chamber, slamming the false wall shut behind me. I leaned against the wardrobe, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and tried to make sense of what I had just experienced. But the laughter continued, growing louder and more menacing until it seemed to fill the entire apartment. I knew then that I was not alone. The entity that haunted the hidden chamber was real, and it had set its sights on me. The diary was not just a warning, it was a trap, designed to lure me into the darkness and bind me to the entity forever. I spent the rest of the night in a state of terror, huddled in the corner of the living room with the lights on and the diary clutched in my hands. The laughter eventually subsided, but the sense of dread remained, a constant reminder of the horror that lurked just beyond the veil of reality. The days that followed were a blur. I tried to convince myself that it had all been a nightmare, a product of stress and exhaustion. But the diary was real, and so was the hidden chamber. I could not ignore the truth, no matter how much I wanted to. I began to research the history of the apartment, hoping to find some clue that would explain the horrors I had experienced. What I discovered only deepened the mystery. The building had been constructed in the late 18th century and had passed through the hands of numerous owners, each of whom had met with a tragic end. There were rumors of occult practices, of secret societies and forbidden rituals, but no concrete evidence to support them. The only lead I had was the diary. I pored over its pages, trying to decipher the cryptic symbols and rituals described within. But the more I read, the more I felt the entity's presence growing stronger. It was as though the diary itself was a conduit, a link between the physical world and the realm of the unseen. One night, as I sat at my desk, surrounded by books and notes, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the hidden chamber. I tried to ignore it, to focus on my research, but the tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it seemed to reverberate through the very walls of the apartment. I rose from my desk, my heart pounding in my chest, and approached the wardrobe. The tapping continued, a steady, unrelenting rhythm that seemed to echo in my mind. I opened the wardrobe doors, my hands trembling, and pushed aside the false wall. The chamber was as I had left it, the symbols on the walls glowing faintly in the darkness. But there was something new, a figure standing in the center of the room, its back to me. It was tall and thin, with long, spindly limbs and a head that seemed too large for its body. The air around it shimmered, as though it were not entirely solid, and I could feel a cold, malevolent energy radiating from it. I tried to back away, to close the false wall and seal the chamber, but my body would not obey. I was frozen in place, my eyes locked on the figure as it slowly turned to face me. Its face was a nightmare, a grotesque mask of twisted flesh and hollow eyes, with a mouth that stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. It raised a hand, its fingers long and skeletal, and beckoned to me. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to step forward, to enter the chamber and join the figure in the darkness. But before I could move, the figure spoke. Its voice was a low, guttural growl, filled with malice and hunger. "You are mine," it said. "You have always been mine." The words sent a wave of terror through me, and I stumbled backward, breaking free of the entity's hold. I slammed the false wall shut and leaned against the wardrobe, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The tapping continued, growing louder and more frantic, until it seemed to shake the very foundations of the apartment. I knew then that I could not stay. The entity was too powerful, too malevolent, and I was no match for it. I packed my belongings as quickly as I could, leaving behind the diary and the artifacts in the hidden chamber. I fled the apartment, never to return. But the entity did not let me go so easily. It followed me, its presence a constant shadow at the edge of my vision. I could hear its laughter in the dead of night, feel its cold breath on the back of my neck. It was as though it had marked me, bound me to it in some unholy pact. I sought help from priests and occultists, from anyone who might have the knowledge to break the entity's hold. But their rituals and incantations were no match for the darkness that had taken root in my soul. The entity was a part of me now, a malevolent force that I could not escape. The Haunted Doll, Annabelle's Curse. In the stillness of an antique shop nestled in a forgotten corner of the town, where cobwebs clung to the corners and the scent of aged wood filled the air, there sat an unassuming object, a vintage doll, no larger than a child's stuffed toy. Its porcelain face, though cracked with time, held a faint semblance of innocence, its painted blue eyes staring blankly into space, as if longing for something. The doll's ragged dress, yellowed with age, only added to its worn charm. Yet there was something undeniably unsettling about it. Perhaps it was the stillness in its gaze, or the way it seemed to watch you as you passed by. Whatever it was, it made visitors uncomfortable, a sense of unease that they could never quite place. It was in this forgotten shop that Annabelle first appeared, an innocent young woman who had recently moved into the area with her fiancé, Greg. Annabelle was a collector of antiques, a lover of things old and steeped in history. She had long admired dolls from the Victorian era, drawn to their intricate craftsmanship and the stories they carried. When she saw the doll sitting silently in the corner, she felt a peculiar pull toward it, a sense of familiarity, though she had never seen it before. "Isn't she charming?" the shopkeeper said, noticing Annabelle's lingering gaze. His voice was raspy, like one who had spoken little in recent years. Annabelle nodded, though the back of her mind whispered that there was something off about it. She attributed it to the shop's dim light, the musty air, or perhaps just her imagination. Still, she felt the urge to purchase it, to take it home, and so she did. Unbeknownst to her, the moment she touched the doll, she unknowingly invited into her life something far darker than she could ever have imagined. The doll sat silently on a shelf in the corner of their apartment, a fixture amongst the other antique treasures they had acquired. At first, Annabelle thought little of it, admiring its delicate features but never questioning why she had been so drawn to it. Greg, her fiancé, was less enthusiastic about the doll, but he did not share her passion for antiques. He made a half-hearted joke about how it gave him the chills, but Annabelle dismissed his concerns with a laugh. But as the days passed, subtle things began to happen. The first sign of something amiss was when Annabelle returned home one evening to find the doll had moved. It was no longer sitting in the corner of the shelf, but had been placed in the center of the room, facing the door as though it had been waiting for her. She could not recall having moved it, but in her tired state, she thought little of it. The next day, she discovered that the doll had shifted again, its tiny porcelain hands now clasped together in a prayer-like position. The subtle movements unsettled her, but she blamed her own forgetfulness, rationalizing that she had shifted the doll and not remembered doing so. After all, it was a doll, a simple thing that could be moved by accident. But then the real terror began. It started with the faint sound of whispers late at night. Soft, almost imperceptible murmurs that seemed to come from nowhere. Annabelle initially thought it was the wind or the creaks of the building settling. But then she heard it again. This time, the words were clearer. "Help me." Annabelle's heart began to race. She rose from her bed, feeling the chill of the air settle over her skin. The apartment was eerily still, the only sound the rhythmic ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. She glanced at Greg, still asleep beside her, unaware of the strange occurrences. Annabelle, too frightened to speak, tried to ignore the whispers, telling herself it was just her imagination. The next morning, as she dusted the shelf where the doll sat, she noticed something peculiar. The doll's eyes, those lifeless porcelain orbs, appeared to be staring directly at her. She froze, feeling a shiver crawl down her spine. She was certain the doll had not been placed that way before. It was as if the doll was watching her, waiting. Her unease deepened when the doll began to change positions without explanation. One day, it was on the couch, sitting upright as though it had been placed there with intent. Another time, it was in the kitchen, standing as if it had wandered there on its own. It became impossible to ignore. The doll was moving on its own, but how? It wasn't long before Annabelle began experiencing other strange phenomena. Her belongings, small items like keys, hairpins, and books, would go missing, only to reappear in odd places. The air in the apartment grew colder, the silence between them more oppressive. Greg, too, began to feel its presence. He woke one night to find the doll sitting at the foot of their bed, its unblinking eyes fixed upon him. His heart skipped a beat, and a cold sweat broke out across his skin. But when he tried to move it, the doll felt unnaturally heavy, as if something was holding it in place. He shoved it back onto the shelf, but he could not shake the feeling that it was watching him. Annabelle dismissed Greg's concerns at first, but then strange things began to happen to her as well. She had vivid nightmares in which the doll stood in the center of a darkened room, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. In the dream, she could hear a voice calling to her, begging her for help. But when she reached out to touch it, the doll's smile twisted into something cruel, and its eyes filled with malice. By the time the strange occurrences escalated, Annabelle was beginning to fear for her sanity. She could no longer deny that something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong with the doll. It was late one night when Greg, desperate and terrified, decided to confront the doll. He moved it out of the apartment, into the hallway, and sat down in front of it. The apartment was quiet, save for the sound of the clock ticking in the living room. He demanded answers, questioning why the doll was tormenting them. But the only response was a silence that pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. Then, suddenly, the doll's porcelain lips parted. "I need your help." The voice was faint, like a whisper on the wind. But there was no mistaking it. The doll spoke. Greg's hands trembled as he stared at the doll, his blood running cold. He asked again, his voice shaking, "What do you want from us?" The doll tilted its head, its eyes staring deep into his soul. "You shouldn't have brought me here." The voice was growing louder now, clearer. It sounded almost angry. A sharp gust of wind swept through the hallway, and the lights flickered, casting long shadows that danced along the walls. The temperature in the room plummeted, and Greg's breath became visible in the freezing air. He backed away from the doll, his heart pounding in his chest.